Hello, good evening. Welcome to our panel discussion tonight on the inclusive future of Web3 financial services designed by and for women. So I'm Elisabeth Carpenter, Chief Operating Officer of Circle. Tonight's panel is co-hosted by us, Circle, and Stellar. Danelle is the Chief Executive Officer of the Stellar Foundation. And so I'm going to introduce these amazing women. I'm literally humbled by being able to moderate a panel with these amazing women. Here's some stats, and there's so many of these, it's crazy, but I'm just going to give you three. More than 1 billion women still have no access to the financial system, according to the World Bank. 1 billion. Here's another one. $300 billion gap in financing for women-owned small businesses. More than 70% of women-owned small and medium enterprises have inadequate or no access to financial services. As my very, very good friend Dante Disparte, standing right there, our Chief Strategy Officer and Head of Policy, has said, when the world is essentially operating on half of its cylinders when it's empowering men, to the exclusion of women. So this begs the question, what can Web3 do to change that? So before we dive in, let me introduce our fabulous panelists. We have Danelle Dixon, who's the CEO and Executive Director of the Stellar Foundation. We have Sheila Warren. My God, you literally all sat in the order I have this. Is that even possible? My God, that's amazing. Sheila Warren is the CEO of the Crypto Council for Innovation. Janet Foutty. Correct. Awesome. Executive Chair of the Board of Deloitte. And Jennifer Lassiter. Do you like to go by Jen or Jennifer?
Either one, never Jenny.
Cool. All right.
Yeah.
All right. Not Jen.
Now you'll call me Jenny.
That's a lot of stress. And she is the Executive Director of the Digital Dollar Project. So what I want to do is actually just start with you all giving brief introductions as to what you do and how that is relevant to this topic, but also personally, how is this relevant to, why is this topic relevant to you and why does it speak to you?
Thank you. So awesome to be here with everyone, and thank you all for being with us. So Danelle Dixon, the CEO and Executive Director of the Stellar Development Foundation. So the Stellar Development Foundation is a nonprofit entity that's focused solely on creating equitable access to the global financial system. We think one of the best ways to do that is to leverage the Stellar Network, which is a global blockchain, global public permissionless blockchain that can be leveraged most awesomely for payments and asset issuance. So we focus a lot on bringing new players into the ecosystem. We focus a lot on public policy domestically in the US as well as outside in lots of regions. Sometimes outside of the US, we find that it's better to rely on the local stakeholders and to support them rather than to come in and tell them how we think it should be done. And we also bring a lot of folks to Stellar that are entities that are building in fintech and who may want to be able to leverage the value of Stellar for their product. And we try very hard to focus on the balance of having a diverse group of folks to create true network effects in the ecosystem. And I'll tell you, even with our great effort at doing that, the numbers still aren't where I'd like them to be. But we pay very close attention. In fact, I'll tell you that we have a fund where we do investments in companies, and I would say 95% of the time, the folks who are coming to seek investment from us are an all-male panel, and oftentimes an all-white male panel. And at the very end of every one of those calls, I say, the next time we meet, I'd like you to bring a more diverse group of folks, and I'd like to see some women, but I don't want them to be here because you just need them to be here to satisfy my request. I want them to have real power and authority in your organization. And it is something that I think is really important because those of us that can do that should do that. And so that's one of the things that I like to focus on. So for me, personally, this is a really important topic. I have 5 boys, so I am I am alone in much of this at home.
5 boys.
And so we spend a lot of time talking about the value of having that diversity of ideas for innovation, for creativity. And so it's really important to me, not just that my boys see how important it is to have the table that is big and wide and open for everyone, but also that they really value the contribution efforts that everyone can bring. And so for me, this is just one of those easy steps that we can take. And so we focus on not just, as I said, women and women-led businesses in the ecosystem, but also in our organization. We spend a lot of time and effort creating that diversity, and this is all really important to me because, again, those that can should. So
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Sheila.
Yeah,
It's always so hard to follow.
Yeah, exactly.
I have 3 girls. She has 5 boys. Even on that axis, I'm like, there you go. Yes. So I'm the CEO of the Crypto Council for Innovation, and we are the premier global alliance focused on advancing crypto innovation and inclusive growth. And so that last part is really where I've spent my career, frankly, focusing on how do we acknowledge that innovation is going to follow traditional patterns if we don't very actively disrupt those patterns. Right? So one of the worst things I think could happen in a crypto ecosystem is we digitize exactly what we have before, which means all of the inequity, all the lack of access, all of that is going to just port over directly into our new system. And I am focused a lot on regulation and policy, and what we're seeing is in the quest to provide, I think, needed and necessary and appropriate in some cases regulation in this ecosystem, we're defaulting to old models. And where have those old models led us? Well, they have not led us, I think to the point Danelle made so eloquently, to a world in which we have equal access. We have the ability for people to engage in an empowered way in the financial ecosystem. And leaving aside even the financial ecosystem, thinking about moving beyond that into what else blockchain technology and crypto can empower, thinking about the ways that we can engage with our data as individuals, right? All of this is critically important. We've already seen in many cases crypto, blockchain technology as a tool of engagement. Because of the pseudonymity that the system can provide, you're able to engage in certain kinds of activities that might have in the past been controlled by your head of household, who may not necessarily have your best interests or your family's at heart, or by the government of your country, who may view you as a woman, as a second-class citizen, or even not even really a citizen in many cases, and not give you certain kinds of fundamental rights. We're seeing as civil liberties and civil rights get stripped away all over the world, including the United States, I think recent developments, we're seeing how these networks can provide access to things that we used to take for granted. So again, I have 3 girls, and it's critically important to me that we demonstrate, I'm creating a world, right? So to me, this is very much not about what I can achieve in real time for myself and those who are my contemporaries. It's about thinking beyond even my kids' generation to their kids' generation. As we see the world wrestle with more and more complicated problems, climate migration, I don't want to call it the Kraken, but we're at the point where I don't think this is the last pandemic we're going to see. Okay, there's a lot of this kind of thing happening. I'm not going to name the new one that everyone's like, don't say the word. Yeah. But that thing that's happening, I think that we're just seeing an acceleration in some of this. We're also seeing challenges because of some of these challenges in moving across the border physically. Right? It's not as easy as it used to be to move, to migrate, whether for being pushed or whether for reasons of finding opportunity. You can now find some of that online, digitally. And I think that the crypto ecosystem is a critical part of that. The new economic models, new governance models that we are actively real-time generating and experimenting with are laying a foundation for what I hope and what we are dedicated to building is a more inclusive environment. So that is what motivates me and why I'm here. I'm so proud and happy to be on the panel.
Rock on. Awesome. Okay, Janet.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for having me. I come to this conversation through a different lens. I do not live sort of every day deep in the space with my amazing panelists. Actually, I'm going to talk about my family first because we're talking about family today. I have 25-year-old twins. My daughter is a 3rd grade special ed teacher in Brooklyn, and my son is doing a PhD in physics. So that try to think about our dinner table is a little crazy. My husband is a professor at a university in Chicago and focuses on in a business school, helps focus on Latinx kids who are first generation actually survive and thrive in their undergraduate education. So that's a little bit about our family, and so you can probably see some connections there to the conversation today. Maybe 30 seconds about Deloitte. For those of you who do not have Deloitte on your radar, Deloitte is the largest professional services firm in the world. Basically 2 major businesses, an accounting business and a consultative business. The bulk of our conversation to date in this space has been in our consultative businesses, where we're focused sort of as our highest level mission on inclusive prosperity and how that ripples through all the work that we do, which means we spend a lot of time thinking about the things we're going to talk about today within the global Fortune 500, as well as in the newer economy and in the startup economy. So we sort of come at it through both lenses. A little bit about me personally. I spent the bulk of my career at the intersection of financial services and technology, so very relevant to this conversation, though through a slightly different lens. I'm a quant by background, and I spent most of my career in the derivatives market. But frankly, the reason I was able to take on broader roles within Deloitte and lead our technology business for a number of years, as well as other businesses, is because of my passion in and around talent, and specifically around DEI. So advocating in and around equity in particular has been a place I've spent a lot of my time and energy within our own organization as well as in the market. So that's a little bit about me and a little bit about Deloitte.
Wonderful. Thank you. Jennifer.
Amazing. I'm having a bit of a fangirl moment right now. These are like all my mentors sitting up here that I've looked up to for a long time. So it's such a great privilege to be here. Jennifer Lassiter, I'm with the Digital Dollar Project. We are also a nonprofit that works out of Washington, D.C. that's focused on exploration around a U.S. central bank digital currency. So we are convening space for the private sector to come together and really bring the weight of their resources and perspective as part of the whole financial ecosystem to the central banks in a testing and collaborative model that results in open data and analysis, right? So our hypothesis is that we think there could be positive societal benefit to a central bank digital currency, but we actually don't know, right? And I think we're going to touch on this because I think it's very similar when it comes to the topic we're talking about tonight, which is how do we generate the data so we're starting from a point of decision making that's factual. So we endeavor at Digital Dollar Project to generate that data and then use that data to hopefully have our central bank, the Federal Reserve System, make a data-driven decision around a CBDC deployment or not. I joined DDP in November. That is relevant because I spent the decade prior with the financial regulator. So I focused mainly on consumer protection and innovation and technology, that intersection, and financial inclusion, universal access, gender parity, wealth distribution, and parity in wealth distribution are all topics that are very important to me. And I will share that that was also my introduction to finance at the beginning of that work. And it's shocking when you start to learn how regulations are made, right? And how we revisit or don't revisit certain parts of regulation and what that process looks like. And I think for me, it was frustrating at many points in that process because I wanted to move faster and there was questions about why we weren't engaging around some of the emerging technologies, some of the benefits that we were seeing globally. So stepping outside of that box, but still being in service of a government entity was important to me, and that's what I do now.
Wonderful. Thank
Yeah,
you very
thank you.
much. All right. So now we're going to dive in. And this is a bit of a two-part question about today and tomorrow. So in terms of today, I'd love to know what you all think about, and we can just go down the line again. What causes women to be excluded from the financial system today? Is it that we're not men? Is it that we aren't, when we walk up to get a loan from a loan officer, we're not a man? Is it that there aren't enough women in leadership positions in the infrastructural layer that enables the financial system to operate and run? That's the today question. The tomorrow question is, what do you think Web3 can do to change this? And if you have any particular projects, indeed perhaps your own, that you think would be worthy of highlighting and sharing with the audience here, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, so I think what you just said in terms of those two pieces, that they're not men. We're not men when we walk up to the teller or the bank representative. I think that's a big part of it. But I also think it goes a little bit deeper that we are women, and a lot of times we've been conditioned that we're not supposed to do those things, and we're not necessarily have the right to have the access there. So I think it's also raising daughters, raising sons to understand that that is not what we're seeing, and that's the tomorrow that we don't want to see. Or that is not the way that things should be. So I think that that's part of it. The other thing is it's absolutely true that women tend to have, a lot of women have jobs outside of the traditional system. And so they don't have the ability to show a W-2 at the end of the year to be able to demonstrate that they have the ability to either get this loan or put money in a bank account and not have the fees attached to it. All of these things we take for granted in a lot of ways, but it's just the truth. And some of it is that they work at home and they don't have the access to the financial system in the same way. So comes through.
Perhaps that got worse because of COVID.
It absolutely did. I mean, we saw that happen in lots of regions where, especially in cash-based societies, where that was already a problem, it became exacerbated. And so I think that there's so many reasons that can be attached to it, but I think it starts with the fact that we're not men. I think tomorrow and the assets that we have already, particularly in blockchain, I think are just so awesome to be able to achieve that. You know, years ago when I was at Mozilla, we were building an operating system that was focused on the open web, all those pieces that are important to me and still very important to me, but not important to the story. And we were focused on thinking about how we can leverage technology to be able to build an application that allowed this woman who doesn't work, but it can make 3 meals during the day, and she can sell 2 of those meals, but how can she do that? Because it's not traditional. And so having an app that allows that to happen is awesome. Having an app that's built on blockchain that allows it to be a digital asset is even better, because then you can easily transact. And so these are the kinds of things that we're seeing being built on Stellar, where, again, we focus a lot on Africa and Latin America, and we see a lot of tremendous value from these local builders solving local problems, solving problems of refugees that are crossing the border. And a lot of these refugees are women with children crossing borders. Carrying cash across a border is a terrible idea, and that's very dangerous. And so if you can carry it in a digital asset, cross the border, and then be able to cash that out wherever you are, that we have a Leaf Global. It's an app that's built on Stellar that can do that.
Leaf Global. Mm-hmm.
There's so many of these applications built locally by local developers that are solving their local problems. And a lot of these problems are solving not just problems for women, but problems for families. And so this is tomorrow. And I think tomorrow is actually already here.
Yeah, okay.
But it just takes time for this adoption to happen.
Yeah, excellent. Sheila?
Yeah, so everything Danelle said about today, but I'll add, I think, who do we as a society empower to take risk, right? So when it comes to engaging in something that is new, whether it's new technology, whether it's a new form of investment, whether it's a new form of activity, we have a culture, and I think this is true pretty much globally, where men the failure of something that a man tries to do is viewed differently than the failure of a woman. Because partially because the consequences are seen as the opportunity cost of not being with your family and not raising your kids and not whatever it is viewed differently. And you see this reflected in all kinds of industries. It's the fact that VC funding, where does it go? It's the fact that new industries tend to start being very male-dominated, right? And it isn't even so much about socioeconomic class, it's about the tolerance for failure and the appetite for risk that we as a culture, as a global society, empower men with that we don't empower women with. So that's just kind of a nuance on exactly what Danelle said, but everything else I think I totally agree with that. In terms of tomorrow, which I agree is kind of today, I think that what I am really, I'm so bullish, frankly, on the crypto and Web3 ecosystem for so many reasons. But one of those is I think it's a new model of governance. And so thinking about something like a DAO and how you can put in engagement, and that engagement can be valued in ways that are determined by a community, is really powerful. So I spent almost a decade in civic technology, and civic technology is really focused on how do you empower a community to use technology to decide, how do you empower people to make decisions as a community? How do you create, again, that collaborative model and that governance, as we call it in this ecosystem, model that's going to engender sustainable decisions, right? And hold accountability within those decisions in a transparent way. That's exactly what this technology is designed to do. You almost have to try to not create that transparency in the system, really hard, right? It's not easy. So it comes naturally, and that I think is a model that accommodates different kinds of governance, different kinds of ways and modes of engagement that I do think are more open. And I do think that the risk you can put in with sweat equity in a way can often be rewarded in a lucrative financial way, whereas in the past you had to have access to these gatekeepers, to your point about the loans, et cetera, that could give you that initial boost. So a lot of these things, I think, again, these are not so much tomorrow, but it is taking time, I think, for popular understanding and awareness to catch up with what's going on here. Education, exactly. So that's kind of how I see this. But my hope is that I'm super hard, and I should also mention, just that so many of the layer ones are run by women. Right, you've got Danelle, you've got Stacey Ward and Algorand, you've got Marie Flamant at NEAR, you've got, I'm sure I'm going to forget a whole bunch. There's so many of these, Aya Miguchi at the Ethereum Foundation, just women who are driving a lot of this and are bringing, I think, a very powerful sensibility to how to think about community creation.
Yep, absolutely. Are there any projects, given your role in particular, because you see so many different things, is there anything that really jumps to mind as something that can sort of put a picture to the words?
I think that there are a number of different projects that are focused specifically on education and empowerment of women. So it's about, everything Stellar is doing. I think you heard the approach here, right? And I think that approach is reflected in some of the other kinds of protocols, like Cello has a similar approach to some things, Algorand in some cases has an approach to those kinds of things, NEAR. So I think, again, because these are women-led foundations, you're seeing that sensibility be pervasive and consistent across all the different things that they're building, depending on the geography and culturally specific. I think in addition to that, just a lot of the activity that's happening in DAOs. And again, I'll cite DAOs over and over again. Some DAOs are toxic cesspools, let's be really honest, right? But that's less and less of that is happening. A lot of them are places where you're seeing women really dominate the conversation openly as women, right? Their avatars are women. They're very open about the fact that that is what they're bringing to the table, and they're bringing that identity layer into the work that they're doing. So I feel that there's so much that's happening in that space, and I feel like if we can reconstruct our model of shareholder extractive capitalism and embed more of this, the forum calls it stakeholder capitalism, into the ecosystem from the jump, I think we're going to see dramatic transformation.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Janet.
So a couple thoughts to add on there. I'll talk a little bit from a corporate perspective because I think leadership in that dimension matters a lot. And I'll do a little good news, bad news. So the good news is, if you didn't see the sort of news flash today, we're at a record number of women leading Fortune 500 companies, which is amazing. And 2 of the 3 new additions are from financial services. So that is amazing. However, that is still a travesty because it is 44 women. Okay, so there's some good news, bad news. Sort of next piece of bad news, I would say, is we just completed a survey of 1,200 financial services organizations around the globe, and 20% of their executive teams are women on average. So that is not great. The good news, however, is that a third of those organizations have more than half of their executive leadership team as women. So progress bit by bit by bit. Because you can probably tell by me sharing these statistics with you that I absolutely believe leadership matters and who's around the table matters. And financial services designed for women, by women, to borrow my good friend Sally Krawcheck's expression, I think is so critical to the conversation. So I just wanted to sort of add that lens of sort of senior level leadership and progress that we're making bit by bit to that end against the backdrop of which you all shared. In terms of where we're going, I'll just quote a quick tidbit from a survey that we just completed. We do an annual blockchain survey, and pretty broad, very broad survey, and we bucket everyone who participates into the survey in terms of sort of where they sit on the sophistication spectrum. So there's a pretty small number. It was only 60 out of, I think the survey number was 1,800, 60 who we put in the pioneer category. But what gives me great hope and optimism, to echo the optimism theme, is that those 60 put as the number one sort of positive attribute of how they were leading in the market was all around financial access and inclusion. And so we need to get everyone up to that pioneer category, but and that was not a lead the witness question whatsoever. So I was absolutely delighted to see that topic sort of bubble to the top. And maybe the one quick project I'll talk about, which is maybe a different lens, is there's an amazing group that is quite organic called the Unstoppable Women of Web 3.0. So check it out. It sits in Twitter and LinkedIn, and it's just a really nice organic space for young women and girls who are excited about learning about Web 3.0 to do so. And then there's some senior citizens like me who contribute into the conversation as well. So that's my quick commercial for a different lens on how we're trying to build community.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Jennifer.
So I think I want to start first by talking about how flawed our data collection is right now in the system. So when we hear the numbers around unbanked, very clearly, to be banked or unbanked means to have a bank account or not, right? That is not an indicator, I think, of whether you are unbanked or banked actually means, right? You're inferring that if you're banked, you receive all of the benefits that come along with being part of a traditional banking system. So when we talk about who's unbanked, and we look at those numbers, I think, sadly, they are larger because we are not capturing correctly what it means to use banking products outside of having a bank account. Second, we're not collecting data from fintechs. So we're missing an entire group of money movement when we're looking at what services get traction with whom, right? And again, thinking about the people who are working kind of off the grid, right, and transacting off the grid. So I think one of the benefits that will come in this future of Web3, right, which is a blockchain-based internet, is transparent data and the ability to be able to see where products are actually resonating and with whom. I think another thing that is complex to consider is women are not monolithic, right? So barriers for how I am or am not participating in the financial system is very different than a woman in different cultures and geographic regions in the US and globally. And I think it's not only cultural and economic, it's also race, right? So I think it's really important to acknowledge the difference between white women and women of color and how they're impacted in the system. What I am encouraged about, I think, in Web3 is not necessarily digital masking or being able to show up and not carry that identity forward, but is actually that this is the first time where we aren't putting a Band-Aid on a 90-year-old system, right? We're saying, okay, we're not just going to tackle this problem in this moment. We're going to look systemically at what's not working. We're going to bring all of those voices to the table intentionally, and we're going to design this new system. So for me, I think it's an incredible opportunity to be very intentional about that big tent, right? And that big table and how we're bringing folks into the conversation. And with that note, I will give a shout out to Cleve Messidor, who's doing amazing work as the executive director at the Blockchain Foundation. She's working on really bringing in women of color into the crypto space. And then the Black Women Blockchain Association is on the engineering side of the house. So that's getting women involved, women of color involved with blockchain. And again, I think it's really, really important to create those spaces. And for me, I will say anytime I have an opportunity to amplify and invite women and women who look different from me into the conversation, I'm going to use it.
Yeah.
So
Can I just
Awesome.
tag one thing on?
Of course you can,
Okay.
yeah.
So just a
Please.
quick tag on to your tent conversation. I've been thinking a lot about where we find ourselves in technology broadly as it relates to this conversation, because something that I did not really understand until the last sets of years was in the through actually the mid to late 80s, the dominant number of computer science graduates were women. And that surprises people a lot. And what happened in the mid to late 80s was video gaming. And boys were drawn into the video game community and sort of drowned out the girls' voices in the conversation in and around computer science. So one of the reasons I'm so passionate about this topic and how do we make sure that we, to your design from scratch and keep the tent really wide is so important, because we've seen what can happen when we don't keep the aperture really wide open as we did in more traditional computer science.
Yeah, that's a really great segue to the final topic before we either go to Q&A or we can just continue the conversation informally on the floor. But in terms of just advancing a lot of this good work that you're talking about is already being done today, I'd love for you to just talk about, on the one hand, what are the kind of unintended consequences that might erupt because of what's happening in Web3? So it's a slightly different take on the earlier question. But then also, what's a message you just want to have this audience leave the room with in terms of a little slightly more optimistic message about where this is going to go?
Well, so if I think about going back to my earlier topic about the 95% of the folks that come to present to us that are seeking investment are men, there was one organization, Tala, I don't know if you know them, they're a great organization. They brought all women to the meeting, and it's because Shivani, who's the founder and CEO, they happen to have a significant number of women in their organization in the executive positions. And so that was a conversation that was great for us. I literally said, this is the first time this has happened, and we get presented to like a couple of times a week, and it was awesome. But it also, the way that organization is focused on the different parts of their work globally and how they're really focused about that inclusiveness, it's because they have that in their organization. And so I think what can we do? One of the things that I think we can do is really try to bring that into every organization. We try, as I said, to bring it into the companies that we want to bring to the network to create those network effects, not always as successful as we like. But part of our enterprise fund, which is our fund that puts money out into the ecosystem from an investment standpoint, we did a specific and targeted focus on female leaders and female entrepreneurs and said, look, we want you, and here we want you to do this. We sometimes have to do that to make it so that they understand that we're targeting them too. And the other thing I'll say is that I think, in particular for blockchain, I love what you just said, Sheila, about all these women. who are leading these different organizations, it's not as evident because there are lots of non-women that are leading lots of other organizations. And so one of the things we have to be is very aggressive about bringing in these new leaders to blockchain and technology. When I was in the tech sector, not in blockchain, the numbers were not so awesome for female leaders, and then when I came into blockchain, it was like abysmal. And so we need to be really, really focused on it, because I think women tend to want to take less risks because of all the things that Sheila talked about, and that's also in their jobs, because they don't know that they can, or they don't understand that it's not so risky here. So that's one of the things that I think we can do. When I think about the future and what Web3 allows and like how we can get there and all of these awesome things, like it is just so amazing, the opportunity across the board in terms of what we can bring into Web3. And I would just love to be able to talk about all of the, not just the women-led organizations, but all of the organizations, and they're doing some really phenomenal work. I do believe, though, and this is a lot of my bent and a lot of how we focus on this for the organization, a lot of it is by focusing on local builders, because they tend to not be, like Silicon Valley, which is where I happen to be from, a lot of times we think we can solve the world's problems, and the truth is we just can't. We don't know a lot of their problems. We don't know the solutions that they need, and so I love that local building. I love focusing on that because they tend to be a bit more inclusive than we do.
And that's also why you need to have a diverse workforce, because otherwise you're just continually representing the same point of view and holding out for that diversity hire who's as good as the non-diversity hire.
Exactly.
But you just got to find them, because there aren't as many of them around, particularly depending on the age group you're looking at, is so critical also.
It's intentionally creating that. And it doesn't have to mean that you hire all diverse talent.
No.
It means that your slate is diverse, and that's the one thing that I think we all have to agree on. And I just want to get to Jennifer's point about the data. One of the things that we've talked a bit about with some of us is like really actually coming together to create that data that's missing, to be able to pull it together from the ecosystem at large, from the companies that are already building in the ecosystem, and create that what we know what it is right now, so that we can grow and build from it. So it's one of the things I would love for us to come together and do. Lots of folks, lots of people in the industry, so that we can create that knowledge base and then know where we're starting from.
Super, wonderful.
Yeah.
Sheila?
So I fall a lot on my civic tech background, because one of the tenets of civic tech is this phrase we come back to again and again on I love building teams. This is the third team I've built in like 7 years, I think. I just love building teams. It's build with, not for. And the idea there is when you're building for, you're automatically assuming that you have knowledge, you have something that is more valuable than the community that you are aiming to serve. That is a fallacious assumption 100% of the time. Like 10 out of 10 times, that is wrong, right? And so we tend to think about user focus groups and things like this, but in the environment where we're looking at who has not been served by this technology, who has not been served by a financial system, who has been historically excluded from opportunities, whether it's legacy financial, whether it's legacy tech, all these kinds of systems, we have to educate ourselves. But the best way to do that is to bring people to the table. And so this build with, not for concept is something that it just imbues everything that I do, right? And again, the thing I want to leave people with, to kind of to skip ahead to your last question, is this is not new. There's decades of civic tech, right? The book I throw at people is I'm like, go read Paulo Freire, read Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Like, there is a lot of activity and thinking and philosophy around how you do this effectively. And so folks in civic tech have been doing it for decades now. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We don't have to invent all these models and figure out, what do we do? How do we do it? How do we, And the other thing is, to Danelle's point about intentionality, people don't magically appear. They don't just like randomly show up. Like, oh, hey, they have to be invited, and then they have to be engaged and included. And it's not enough to just kind of say, hey, come on over and now you're here. Like, it's like you have to take active steps to make sure that you are encouraging those voices.
You have to be in their communities, you have to be reaching out.
Right. And it's not just recruiting pipelines. It's saying, like, what do you need to be held in this space as an equal, to be actively heard and solicited for your input, for your advice, for your wisdom that you're bringing to the table, right? So community creation is something we have to think about within our institutions, within our user participant ecosystems, and generally as a broad community, right? So when I talk about DAOs being toxic cesspools, okay, so I'll go back to that because it's kind of, I think the initial phases of this, you saw a lot of the behavior that's Web 2 dominant, trolling, harassment, all of this happening in online spaces, and pushing a lot of young women in particular out. Like, I have young women friends who left this space because it was so toxic. And no one was looking out for them, for their mental and emotional health, frankly, but even their physical security in some cases, right? It can be scary stuff. And so I think that we owe it to all of ourselves to examine how are we making sure and recognizing that there are real risks to women. They aren't the risks that people think of. It's not the risk of like, I'm gonna lose this or that. It's sometimes a risk of opening yourself up to this kind of toxicity that can be really damaging.
It's also
For
intellectual risk.
safety.
And safety, that's
yeah.
exactly right. That's exactly right.
There's intellectual risk because you have so much jargon and so much, like, you can string a whole sentence together with English words and no one understands what you're talking about in the world of crypto. And that is very daunting, I think, for women in particular who just, they don't understand it and they automatically assume, oh, I must just be dumb. And it's like, no, you're not dumb. Let's just take this down a notch and let's explain this clearly
Meet you
because the
where you
entire
are.
community, right, exactly.
And that's actually about the invitation.
Yeah,
It's an
exactly.
invitation to say, you have different wisdom that's important.
Right.
Right, there may be things like my team that I'm building here at the council is not all crypto native,
Yeah.
but there are things that every single person on my team is there
Totally.
for a reason, and there are a multiplicity of
Yeah,
reasons. Right, sometimes that's their crypto knowledge,
Yeah.
sometimes it's something else, and sometimes it's the mere fact that they're a different generation from me.
Absolutely.
They have a different orientation to the web than I do. Like
Yeah.
all these things are powerful and important, and I think again, I summarize this in my mind as build with, not for.
Yep.
If you are building with people, and
Yeah.
that is your frame on the actions that you're taking, whether it's in hiring, whether it's in engagement, whether it's in product build, whether it's in design, whether it's in policy, whatever it is, it just flips your thinking in a way that I think it has ripple effects that are so powerful.
I love that. I'm totally going to steal that. But give you credit, as I did with
It's not
Monte
mine.
earlier.
I mean,
Absolutely,
like I said.
promise.
As I see the champagne glasses getting lower, I'll try to keep this quick. I think I talked about my fear. I share actually your sensitivity in and around product design and safety for women in
Yeah.
particular. But the way I've been thinking about this topic is challenging every organization that I touch to think about equity through three lenses and financial equity through three lenses. The first is within your own organization. Is everyone that is working for you have the education and access they need to access the markets? The second is in the products that you build with, not for, and is every lens of product design and marketing through a lens of gender equity and or tip toward women, because we know there's
Yep.
obviously
Yeah.
the balance. And the third is how are you engaging in your communities writ large, which I know is the work that's so important
Yeah.
to all of you.
Yeah.
So sort of the equity lens for your people, for your products, and in the community is what I'd like to leave the conversation with
Wonderful,
today.
thank you. And finally, Jennifer.
So I'll talk about the unintended consequence, actually, if we don't do all of these things very intentionally now, which is creating a divided system. So I think we run the risk both of overcompensating, I don't know if that's possible, but it could be right, and creating an other as we think about inclusion, and then folks joining this other, and it causes I don't want to join that Web3 thing because that's for those people. And conversely, right, creating the Web3 for the people who are in the jargon and in the know, and then not taking the time to do the education and the onboarding. And that is very dangerous. And particularly when you think of one of the barriers being that I think financial education, digital education, just literacy in general, right? Like you can tie most countries' female literacy rates to also the rise or decrease in their participation in traditional banking services. So I think being very intentional now, which I think we are doing, right?
Yep.
I think we're being very loud and very public about this. But some of that unintended consequences, if we have our blinders on and just move
Yeah.
forward, will be creating two systems, and you lose the mass adoption if you do
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
It loses its appeal. Please, go ahead.
Add one thing to that, because one of the things, when I mentioned the fact that we created the enterprise fund and then this special focus on women, there was so much backlash from the ecosystem. So
For this
remember
panel,
that.
there was on social
I know,
media.
if you saw
I don't
social
know if you
media,
saw that.
That's the thing,
Exactly.
yes. And I think that what I would ask all of you out there is to not put up with that backlash and to try to do your part to stop that backlash. Because I think that's we don't want to create it. I get so much in my, I'm sure many of you do, but in my social media, I had to stop reading the replies because they're so aggressive, especially if I say anything about gender issues.
Interesting.
And so I can, not read the stuff, but if someone's coming up through this, we could create a situation where they don't want to be a part of that, but they want to be a part of this.
Yeah.
And that's such a great point.
Right.
That's one of the reasons I use the word equity so deliberately. And we've been talking here about gender, but I think racial equity
Yeah, absolutely.
and ethnicity certainly in many of our markets is as important as well.
Yeah.
So That's how I've tried to push my thinking in
Yeah.
and around making sure that we don't create
Yeah.
Yeah.
two systems.
Right.
That was very articulate.
Yeah, absolutely. Excellent. Well, I think this is a great place to, we can pick up the conversation here. This is a pretty small venue, so please feel free to come up to any of us, but I think I'll just thank you all very much for doing this today. It's a real honor and privilege to have had this conversation with you, and I hope everyone enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.